Ike here of Ike Comics. I'm going to show how I color First Sun and Sword, the comic I've been doing on the draw process videos. First thing I do is drop a dark yellow-green because I've just got one color and 5 different shades for this comic. So the dark yellow-green, I throw it on the entire canvas, the entire page. So I'm using a paint bucket tool in Clip Studio. My version is actually Manga Studio 5, I believe. I need to update it. But I drop that in using the paint bucket, selecting to not refer to other layers so that it just covers the whole thing. Then I switch to white and refer to other layers to fill the gutters with white. Then I choose the lightest color that I know I'm going to use for the sky, and I drop it in on every panel. That starts to bring things forward, bring things as ready as they're going to be for the harder decisions. So I really like the Clip Studio Paint Bucket tool because it's really good at closing gaps. So if your line work leaves an opening, you can select how sensitive to set that so that it will close that gap. You can set it to go beyond the line work. So instead of having a little thin gap where your color stops and there's a gap before the ink starts, it will go as far as you want, 1 or 2 pixels beyond, to fill in behind the line work so that there's no gaps. Now, because I threw the dark yellow-green on everything, everything will have color on it. I think that's a really nice trick, is that there will be no spots behind line work or next to them that is just white, because it's at least this dark yellow to start with. I don't do different layers. This is all on one layer because it's so simple that it's fine to do that way. So I'm coming in with the other colors, the other shades of this yellow. You'll see in the bottom left, perhaps it's pretty small there, but I have a color palette, just the colors saved, and I can reference that for the 5 shades I need. So there is the local color, you might call it, or shade, like value of, well, there is no local shade technically, but you have a local value for his skin, his shirt, and so on. But it's not really helpful to think in those terms, especially with a super limited palette. That with different lighting, with different distance from the eye or the camera, you're going to use different values. And especially with a really limited palette, you're going to have to vary the color of things, the shade I choose. I'll have to vary it some so that things can stand out from each other. So the sky is the lightest shade, and then a medium shade is the canal, the water on the canal. And for now, I put it up on the building on the side because I just wanted to see, like, okay, this middle yellow shade is the mid ground. The farthest background is the sky, this lightest color. The things in the foreground need to have a greater variety of shades to them. So things that are closer to your eye typically have greater contrast. They're going to have both more dark and light values in most cases. So he has, dark values, dark shades on his belt, the fabric around his waist, and a few items, right? And then the lighter shirt, so that it stands out off of that midground. The raft is my second to darkest, so we'll call that medium dark. So I needed his pants to be lighter than that or darker than that. I went with lighter than that. And then for the foreground figure, Farah, I've got her as the darkest values and also quite a few brighter values so that she really stands forward in the image. Not a lot of play in that, not a lot of options when you have just these 5 colors. You'll see me taking this paint bucket tool and just dragging my cursor around. I use a mouse, drag the cursor around to fill in the raft here. And then sometimes I'll use a polygon tool to capture, rarely maybe a pen tool to capture like the thinnest things, or like the parts that aren't closed by my line work. There are times that I don't have line work to show me where the edge of something is, like especially if it's getting far from your eye, or it's a bright light source, or something. I don't always close those lines or have any lines at all. And so I use color to show the variation in those cases. And that will require a different tool, like a polygon tool. There's no play with opacity. There's no play with layering shades. Like there's literally just 5 flat colors applied on the same layer. It's faster, it's simpler, and that's just what works for me for this comic. My main focus is to get greater efficiency and to make a good looking, finished comic, but greater efficiency and to apply the most effort where it is the most needed for me. And for me, that is in the drawing, in the inking and drawing phase. It's got to be a almost daily practice that I engage in to improve in. The coloring, I can go a few months or more without doing it, and I know how to do it when it's time to come back to it. I can't do that with the drawing. So the coloring has really taken as much of a back seat as I can let it, to not eat into those other things that I really want to focus on. But I want the comic to look good. So I could have done black and white or grayscale. I've done it before. But if you're going to take the time to do grayscale values, then why not use a single tone or 2? I think in the next issue of this comic, the next episode, I probably will, at least on my end, attempt and play with trying multiple colors in a palette. But yeah, for this one, I wanted some color, and I wanted to have shade values, and not just leave it black and white. I have pretty strong blacks versus whites. Like I think my images read pretty well without any color, but you do leave. You have less options of that. Variation really helps things stand out and pull figures off the background and so on. So just having some even grayscale values tends to help. I've printed comics quite a few times in the past, and it was trial and error for me to figure out what shades, how dark to go, and with colors too, what colors to choose. I'm not going to focus on that. There's definitely other places you can look for that information that is going to do better than I can at explaining color theory and stuff. But I do know that when it comes to the inks and the color, the shades, the value, I want my inks to be completely black. And I've played with this before, but it is turned into a bitmap. There's only black pixels and white pixels by the time I color it for the inks. Now there's an art to that. There's an art to, or a process that's involved in getting the greatest quality inks and not losing pixels, not losing detail. If you turn up contrast or play with the curves on your inks and on the scan that you do, you'll see that you're going to lose some ink if you want to lose some of the pencil marks, some of the imperfections. You want those to kind of disappear. But you don't want to lose any inks, and there comes a point where you can lose inks if you turn the contrast up too much. I guess to keep it real kind of brief here, I work in a very large file size with lots of pixels, so that when it gets bitmapped into just black and white pixels, you're not getting low quality jagged edges to your lines. You're getting, because there's a lot of resolution there. But then when I work on it here, it is at comic book size at 450 DPI, dots per inch. By the time I print it, it's usually 300 DPI once I save this file. But I'm working at 450, but the file was much bigger, so that you don't get the pixelation in that bitmap. So yeah, very black inks. Then with the colors, I try not to go too dark. There is a point at which, depending on your printing quality too, the colors would be so dark, adding so much, black K value to the paper that it prints on, that it makes it harder to see your ink lines. So if you have a style like mine where the ink lines are meant to be seen, they're very graphic, they're meant to be edges of things, then you need to keep your colors above 80 or 70 K value, black. You don't want them too dark, so that you have that contrast between your inks and the colors. I don't know exactly what this one was. The darkest shade on here, it's probably like at a 70% K value, 70% dark. Let's see. The other thing that'll happen is when you print the comic, even if you stay above 70, it's going to look too dark on the page if the majority of the panel is that dark. Even if you want a dark, scary comic book, you need lighter values in the panel. Some percentage, I don't know, 25, 30% of it needs to be pretty light, above 25 or 30%. Like you need that variation so that it's not just this wall of muddy darkness. It needs to have the brighter spots to see. So that could be just a highlight on figures that are rather dark, but the highlight's very bright. There's lots of ways to do it. For me, this palette is pre-set up by me to have a complete range of values, and I intentionally use a good range of values on every panel. And that would be the case even if it was in a dark location. Right now they're in a kind of noontime, bright outdoors space. But the color choice, the values I choose would still be almost the same if it was in a dark location, which will be the case in a later scene in this issue. So I would use more blacks in my inks, more shadow, I would probably use more darkest values, but there would still be some lighter values in each panel. Okay. Yeah, so sometimes I zoom out so that I can see the panel in full from a distance, like almost like thumbnail sized. You kind of want to see, does this read? If you just quickly look at the image, do you get the sense of what's your focal point, your foreground, middle ground, background, everything's separated well. So sometimes I zoom out and take a look at it and change my choices. So, like these oars here, the water is my medium shade. So I went with my medium light shade for the oars because I needed them to pop somewhat off of that background. And that is the exact same shade as his shirt. And they kind of touch at one point. It is okay, I find, to let the same shade, the same color touch another object that's the same color. Like we may think that we need every object, like a person's, his shirt and the oar, that we need them to be a different shade, a different color, or the person's, the reader's going to confuse them, see them as one object. That isn't true exactly. So the color can help distinguish the objects, but there's other things that people, cues people get that show when things are together or not. Form, pattern, these kind of things. So that oar is clearly crossing across his body at a different angle. It's a different shape than his chest, than the shirt. There shouldn't be any problem getting those confused. Now he's in the foreground, so one thing that I do, because everything's already the darkest shade and I just add the lighter ones on top, that paint bucket tool it closes some sections of because it closes a gap in the line work. Sometimes it will only fill in half of his leg, let's say, and then the other side of where I've put some lines or shadow indications on his leg here on the left of that panel, it won't fill in that other side. Those are really good accidents. It's faster this way to just let those accidents occur. So when I click that, I can see, do I like this having two shades to it? Now he's in the foreground, and his leg's rather large on the panel, so I can have two shades on his leg to increase the contrast, increase the interest on that object, because it is in the foreground. And it is larger. But if one of those guys in the background, if I were to make each leg a different color or try to show two different values on their leg, it is just too small to be worth it. It would just be confusing. It's not realistic because there wouldn't be that amount of variation at that distance from your eye, from the camera. I could see someone starting with their middlemost color and then building darker and lighter. I like to go with the darkest first and then build everything else on top of it, because it just helps me to think in terms of lighting, to think in terms of I'm bringing these things forward. And do I want to bring them all the way forward or a little bit forward? That's why I start with the darkest. I'm just kind of adding light to things. If I started with the lightest or a middle color, it would be a slightly different way of thinking. So yeah, that's why I do that. And I've done that for a long time. Even with more complex color palettes, I will, like in Musical Mishaps of Cat and Fiddle, I go with like my darkest kind of cool tone and then fill in on top. There are times that I don't use the paint bucket if it's going to be slower. So like if there's a lot of complex little pieces to something in a panel, it would make sense to just make all of that, just select the whole area and make it that color you want. Maybe make the whole panel that color, kind of work in reverse. Like I could make the whole panel the middle tone that I'm really going to need in these little intricate parts, and then go in and add the darker parts. And I'll do that sometimes, knowing that I can't think as well, make choices as well in that state, but it will just speed it up sometimes. And there's a lot of pausing, and this is in real time, this recording of me doing the coloring. And there's a lot of pauses where I'm looking at it, I'm zooming in and out, I'm thinking, does this separate things the best? Does this distinguish the fore and middle ground and so on the way I want? And I run into these little problems where it's like, okay, her leg is the same color as the boat right now. Should I bring the boat into forward, light it more, or what? Should I put a highlight on her leg, for example? Sometimes I do, you'll see here I am playing with, which shade should I use? But when I went lighter, it brought her back, it kind of like made her blend in more with the mid-ground elements. She's in the foreground, so I needed her to be a darker shade to really stand out and separate. So I changed it back. But sometimes I do just add a highlight on a figure, even if, there's not a line that I made that can kind of guide the paint bucket for that spot. I will just take a polygon tool and capture the space with jagged edges, pretty geometric, sharp edges. Just abstractly capture an area that I want to add that highlight. And that's my style. I like the more abstract and sharp edges to any lines that if I'm going to put a line in with color, I just want it to be a hard line. And it's just a stylistic choice. In the past, I have used other styles, but this is what is working for this issue, this comic. So that's it. If you have questions, let me know. I'm happy to share more about this. But I wanted you to see actually how I color these pages, because that's something I don't get to show in the draw process videos. Okay, catch you next time.